My name's Ian Thomas. I'm based in the UK and I work for QuantStack. I'm going to talk to you about subshells, bringing multi-threading to Jupyter Kernels. There's a QR code on the right-hand side here which takes you through to a live version of the docs on the web. There's also a GitHub repository listed underneath. If you don't want to get these now, that's fine. You can follow the links through from the JupyterCon schedule to a PDF that contains all of this, so you can get it in a few weeks' time if you wish. Some of this talk is necessarily technical. It's too late, you can't leave the room now, you're going to have to sit it all out. What is the problem we are trying to solve? You cannot interact with a kernel whilst it is busy executing code. I'll translate that into English. If you're running a Python Jupyter notebook and you run a code cell, if that code cell takes a long time to run, you want to run the next code cell, well, you can try to do that, but the second code cell will only start running when the first one is finished. So you can queue a whole bunch of separate code cells, but you can only run a single one at any one time. Wouldn't it be nice if we could run more than one code cell at the same time? How would that help? Well, it would enable us to do things like check the kernel state during a long calculation. So that could be something like if your code cells use some loop variables, we could check how far they've got, the percentage of progress. We could perhaps look at resource usage like CPU usage, if that was important. We could visualize intermediate results. So if you have a calculation that generates some graphical output and is sort of progressive in some way, rather than wait for the end when you get the whole results in one go, perhaps we can look at intermediate results as the process goes along. What I'm really saying is we can execute arbitrary code in parallel. So the answer to that problem is kernel subshells. What are they? A separate thread of execution which can run code independently of the main shell and shares the same memory space. In other words, it's just another thread. But it brings multi-threading to Jupyter Kernels. Of course, historically, you can always, in any code cell, create as many new threads as you wish and do whatever you want with them. So these threads are special in the sense that they understand they're running in a Jupyter kernel. You can send code to be executed on a particular subshell. I'm going to give you some history, which hopefully is of interest. It's certainly important to know some of this stuff. If you want to make changes to Jupyter, and they're big changes or they're changes to the protocol, you have to go via a Jupyter enhancement proposal. So Jupyter at its heart is the Jupyter protocol, a mechanism and a set of messages that you can exchange between the front end, which could be JupyterLab, and the kernel, which is running somewhere. If you want to change the protocol, then you basically have to write a Jupyter enhancement proposal. The enhancement proposal for kernel subshells is JEP, Jupyter Enhancement Protocol number 91. Let's click on that. Good, the Wi-Fi's working well. So this is the outcome of the discussions of what Jupyter kernel subshell should be. There's just a few sides, it's very technical, there's no extra information there. Quite small, really. Let's go back. The PR, which ended up in those 2-3 pages of text, is slightly more complicated. Somebody's laughing. So here's the PR, which led to that. So I'll scroll down. So we've got a number of people commenting, exchanging information, chatting. Dun, 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 dun. Here we go, keep going. Oh, there's a bit more here. We go from just being text to there's a few tables. Oh, there's a bit more text. Somebody's written some code. Oh, that's me. There's a video. More tables. Anyway, you get the idea. Eventually, we get to the bottom, and the JEP has been approved. So at some point in September last year, the JEP was approved. We were allowed to go ahead. Oh, that's an annoying noise. I'm not really expecting anybody in the room to ever read any of that, but you obviously are welcome to if you wish. There were 2 alternative implementations discussed. The one that we have got now, kernel subshells, where you would address your subshell by the same kernel ID as the main shell and a new subshell ID, so you need 2 pieces of information. The alternative implementation was called dependent kernels. That was very similar, except that you would refer to the new subshell via a completely new separate kernel ID. In other words, the subshell, even though it's just a single thread, was pretending to be a full kernel. Really, those two alternatives give the same amount of work for me as implementer. It just depends on which projects they sit in. And the preferred solution was the kernel subshells. I suspect that someday in the future we might reconsider, come back and look at the alternative because they had some other benefits, but we'll have to see. History, page 2. I won't go through all of this. Key observation is took about 3 years to go from beginning to end there. If you jump down to the bottom, ipykernel contains the reference implementation for kernel subshells in version 7. That was released last month. We've had a couple of panic releases since when I've had to fix things that I broke. That's what's available today, essentially. There were actually 2 separate implementations because ipykernel 7 could well have included some other fairly major changes, but they were decided to be too risky. So in the end, I've basically written 2 separate implementations. So the first one was a tester, and then the second one is the real one that we actually now use. I suppose the interesting thing from this page, from my point of view, is that if you want to submit a PR, you want to make a change to a relatively small open source project, submit a PR, get it approved, bang, it can be done quite quickly. Jupyter is a massive ecosystem. There are hundreds of repositories. You can't just write a PR and get it merged if it's something major like this that is changing the protocol. So it takes 3 years, lots of chat. Proof of concept, i.e. you basically need to implement in advance before you can have it accepted. There's probably an entirely separate talk about how one deals with that in a sensible way so your changes can be agreed and merged, but that's not today's talk, unfortunately. So I want to tell you how subshells work. First of all, we'll have a small recap on what a kernel is for those who aren't entirely familiar with the technical terms. So a kernel is a process such as Python running on a computer somewhere. Could be local, could be remote, could be Jupyter Hub in the cloud, whatever. The kernel has a number of what we call channels, separate channels of communication. So shell channel is for the channel that executes your user code, control channel, things like shutting down the kernel, and so on. There are various ones. Each channel can send and receive messages via sockets. The other ends of the sockets are somewhere else. So in a normal JupyterLab setup, they would be sat in JupyterLab, although they sort of go via the server. So you can imagine you've got JupyterLab in your browser, there is some concept of a socket there. The kernel, somewhere else in the world, has the other end of the sockets, and that's how we communicate between the two. Already, before ipykernel 7, a Python kernel was already 8 threads, so multiple threads for the different channels to solve various other problems, and extra threads for the sockets to work in a responsive manner. Here's a little schematic of how we used to, before subshells, communicate with the kernel. This is a UML sequence diagram, so time is going down the page. Left-hand side is the client. Now we can think of that as being you, as an individual user, or the client to be JupyterLab. Right-hand side is the main thread of the kernel. If you want to run some code, we send the execute request, number 1, to the main thread, and the blue bar here represents the execution of that code. When it's finished, it sends back an execute reply saying, I have finished, basically. If we submit another execute request while the first one is running, it's not run straight away, instead it's queued, and it starts to run when the first one is finished. So that's the status a month and a half ago. How do subshells differ from that? Well, a subshell, a separate thread of execution in a kernel process, fine. It is identified by a string subshell ID. That subshell ID for each subshell has to be unique within a kernel, of course. What we tend to do is use UUIDs to be globally unique, just because we use those throughout the Jupyter stack anyway for kernel IDs and so on as well. A subshell is created and deleted via messages on the control channel. So for example, create subshell request will create the thread, get it up and running, and it will send back the new subshell ID so we are able to address it. All shell request messages now support an extra optional subshell ID. If they don't have one, then that means run them on the main shell. If they do have one, run them on the appropriate subshell. and the kernel advertises its ability to support subshells in a very specific way. So you can ask a kernel, do you support subshells? And it will say yes, or I don't know what you're talking about, i.e. no. The major difference actually of importance to most people is there's now a new separate shell channel thread. So previously, the same thread, the shell execution thread, would both execute your user code and also handle the request message you sent to execute that code. So it would wait, message comes in, execute the code. Fine. We can't do that anymore because we can't have the main shell thread handling our messages, otherwise we can never get that code to be passed to the correct subshell. So the new shell channel thread now handles all shell channel messages. That's all its job is. It's basically not doing much most of the time, but if a message is sent, it receives that and handles it very, very quickly. On receipt of a message, it has a look at the header, sees if there's a subshell ID to identify which of the main shell or particular subshell it should execute on. Technical implementation detail, the communication between the shell channel thread and the subshells is a pair of ZMQ improc sockets. That's a technical term basically meaning shared memory, but that has the same API as a normal ZMQ socket, so the code is quite similar to the normal handling of messages. It's also quite fast. Reply messages are also sent via the shell channel thread. We don't want multiple messages using the same socket. That would give us big problems. So here's a sequence diagram with subshells. It's a bit more complicated, but we still have clients, so yourself or JupyterLab on the left. All on the right is the kernel. We've now got shell channel thread, main thread, subshell thread. So the execute request here, always handled by the shell channel thread, has a look at the subshell ID. In this case, it's for the main shell. Send it to the main shell, that can do its thing. Whilst that's running, we can send an execute request on the subshell. Shell channel thread reads the header, sends it to the subshell. Fine, that all seems to be consistent with the problem we're trying to solve. For full completeness, I will add in extra to make it probably too complicated, but these are the addition here of the control thread, so this just shows how we might create and delete the subshell thread. So create subshell request to the control thread, that does whatever magic required to spin up the new thread, returns us the subshell ID, and we can execute. We pass that subshell ID into the execute request. Right, what do you need to try at subshells? Well, essentially, if you create a virtual environment today with Pip or Conda or Pixie or whatever, then everything will work because everything's been released. There are changes to ipykernel. Those are the biggest changes. JupyterLab has some small changes to support them in the user interface. ipywidgets has some support, which we'll get to shortly. And there's a small change to the ipynpl project, which is what gives us interactive matplotlib plots in Jupyter notebooks, also to support subshells. So thank you. We've gone through all the nasty text. Now we get to have some demos, see if I can get this working. So here I am running JupyterLab locally. Is that font big enough? Do you want it a bit bigger? A bit bigger? Okay. That might be too much. Okay, fair enough. So I have a simple example of ipykernel, which will be version 7.1. Let's check it works. You can run some code, yeah. Let's get some information about the process and the thread. So PID, process ID, fine. We've got 9 threads in this kernel already. And the thread that is executing this code is the main thread, so this is the main shell. We have a new subshell magic command, which gives us some of that information in a slightly more structured format. Currently, there are no subshells running in this kernel. Now, the use case is we have some long-running task that we want to run some other code at the same time. So I'm pretending a long-running task here of 10 seconds. All we do is have some sleeps, and then we output a new value every second of those 10. So if we run that, and in the next cell, I'm trying to get B. Of course, we're not using a subshell, so we can't run the second shell until the first one finishes. There we go. So let's try a subshell. If we right-click on the notebook right down the bottom. Crikey. Let me get the right thing. There has always been the option for a new console for a notebook down here. You can run a code console as well as a notebook. Underneath that, if the kernel supports subshells, we have new subshell console for notebook. Let's fire that up. Obviously, normally smaller font, you'd be able to see more at the same time. Looks the same as a normal code console. How can we tell something's changed? Let's rerun the thread info. Sure enough, the thread count has gone up from 9 to 10. There's a new thread running. The subshell magic command in the main shell tells us that there is a subshell existing. If we run some code in the subshell now, so let's just check that A is the correct value. Fine, it's got shared memory with the main shell. Let us do the subshell magic here. So same output as the top, except this proves we are running in the subshell rather than the main shell. So the real test now, let's run our pretend 10-second long 10-second task in the main thread, and then we can execute in the subshell, get the value of B whilst the thing's running. We'll ignore that error. We'll come back to it later. Sure enough, okay, I was too slow. Let's run it again. So B is 2, B is 4, etc. So there we go. We have effectively solved the problem. We can close down this console, and that will nicely delete the subshell for us. So we've gone back to where we are. Right. Simple example done. A bit dull, it's all text. Let's try and do a slightly more sexy example with some ray tracing. So I've got a simple Python ray tracer. It's going to ray trace a nice little scene for us, and it will output the end result PNG. Now, that's quite a long task to run. Don't really know how long it's going to take. Well, I do. It's about 15 seconds, but we're hanging around waiting. Eventually, we get a picture at the end of it. But if I'd done it badly, that could have taken 10 hours, and we'd be waiting for that instead. Okay, we get to the end. Pretty picture. Hooray, great. How can we make that better with subshells? So let's get one open up here. Ooh. Let's just close some of these. Right. So what I'm going to do in my subshell, I'm going to run, copy and paste some code here. I'm going to run a loop, and twice a second, you need to see that better, don't you? Twice a second, I'm just checking the image produced by the ray tracer, and I will update the widget on the left-hand side to contain the latest image. So that's now running. If I do recalculate the image, this will progressively update the image as it goes along. Same output, gives us something a bit more interesting to look at whilst the code is running. Of course, you could have more sensible real-life problems to solve rather than this sort of simple one. Always nice to get some graphics in there, though. Third example, ipywidgets. So ipywidgets is the library containing various user interface widgets that have some representation in the notebook and we can interact with in interesting ways. Here I've created 10 vertical sliders. They're all separate. But then if I connect them together with Python callbacks, so if you move one, all the others will also move. This is really inefficient, but that's sort of the point of the demo. So now those links are set up. If I drag one of these up, down, they all go. Excellent. Not currently using subshells, I should say. So now if we have our pretend sort of 10-second long task, we can do that. Whilst that's running, we want to drag a slider. Oh, the others aren't updating. Because we're executing this our long-running task, the other updates are supposed to be running in the same main shell. They can't run. There are actually lots of interesting use cases of ipywidgets which don't work because of this. You can get around them with some interesting async code, but we don't want to have to do that. So now what we've got is settings editor. If I look up subshells, there's a setting for kernel comms over subshells. Comms refers to the mechanism of communicating between ipywidgets and the kernel. By default, we would normally use this. I disabled this just for the demo, so we started off slightly more cleanly. So if you were to use ipywidgets yourselves today, you get subshells for your comms immediately. So without reloading the code or anything, I can now run my 10-second long task. All of these are moving. The output numbers are all changing. Problem solved. So this example is good because as a user, we have not done anything other than made sure that setting is correct, and it all magically works for us. Hey presto. Warning. This is multi-threaded code. You can get yourself into big trouble. It doesn't hide from you the fact that this is multi-threaded code. If you want to do something dangerous with it, you're very welcome to. You're going to need to learn something about multi-threading if that is dangerous. Most of the examples I showed you, we were just doing like read-only access to something from the main shell. That's because that's generally pretty safe. Future problems that need to be solved, I should mention. Now, the execution count in the first demo was wrong. That hasn't been implemented. We probably will have to have a separate execution count for each subshell. That will need changes to IPython and ipykernel. That's why we haven't done it yet, because that affects other projects. History, the same sort of thing, history of different executions. Would that be in the same, a separate one per subshell? Probably. You can't currently debug from a subshell. You'd have to do it from the main shell. And busy idle's a bit weird, but busy idle's been semi-broken in Jupyter since day one, I think. So we'll have to reconsider exactly what busy idle should be. Okay, quick couple of last slides. For anybody in the room who is a kernel developer, we've got like a checklist. If you wanted to add kernel subshells to your kernel, this is what we do. First of all, you need a separate shell channel thread, and I would do this before the actual subshell work. So create the thread to handle all those incoming and outgoing messages, socket pairs, send messages from the channel thread to the main shell thread, awkward naming. And the main shell thread should execute messages sequentially, one at a time. You need to be careful about which thread you allow to be the main thread. If you're running some GUI loop stuff like matplotlib, Qt, or whatever, heaven forbid, then that would need to be the main thread. So that's just a care needed there. The actual subshells, so you need the kernel info reply, has to advertise the fact that subshells are supported. You need 3 new controlled channel messages, create, list, delete subshells. You've got to actually implement the create and delete and stopping of the subshell threads. Socket pairs from each subshell through to the shell channel thread for exchange of those messages. Execute one message at a time. Care is needed with data that previously was cached per kernel, which is not now correct. An example in ipykernel was we would, on receipt of an execute request message, we would cache the header of that message and use that when we send the reply. Now each subshell has its own, could be processing its own execute request, so you can no longer cache one parent header message per kernel, has to be per subshell. So assumptions that were made which are no longer valid. The %subshell magic command is optional but recommended, very good for debugging. And you're going to need some thread lock mutex stuff at some point. So quick summary where we're at now. Let's get this all in one go because I'm running out of time. If you use ipykernel 7 in JupyterLab now for user code, which is absolutely fine. If you find any problems, please let us know. There's an issue in ipykernel for this. I'm probably the person that has to fix all of those issues. And we've got some ipykernel support, sorry, ipywidgets support, so on. I'm expecting, let's move on to the next page. Where are we going? I'm expecting that some extension developers will modify their code to make use of subshells where available. So things like Variable Explorer would be really useful. Then everybody will benefit without putting any effort in whatsoever as end users. I'm hoping there will be support in other JupyterLab kernels. Anybody needs any help with that, I'm very happy to do that. Please let me know if you get it to work. Supporting the Zeus kernels would be nice because then we wouldn't be restricted to Python. We could have the same generic framework that might work for R and other languages. I expect that's something I will look at if I have sufficient time. There is no support in JupyterLite for multiple threads yet, but I think we might be approaching a time when it would be an interesting research project to look at multi-threads for JupyterLite, and then we could even have subshells there. One page of resources. If you really want to go through all of the PRs, There's been lots of communication about this. This will give you enough of a start point. You can go backward and forward in time from linked issues. Finally, some thanks, firstly to D.E. Shaw, who have funded this work, and secondly to my employer, QuantStack, who's basically paid for me to be here.